Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We want to welcome you to our same time webinar today, a closer look at deploying using Docker. And so we've got two incredible people to help us deliver the messages today. One of those is part of our support team, Anthony Payne, and another is our product manager for Same Time, Trevor Talixon. And so we want to remind you that you may ask questions. There's a questions in the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a little tab there that says questions. If you'll open that tab up, you can ask a question in there and we'll try to answer it as the seminar goes on. And we're looking forward to hopefully providing more information about Same Time and how to deploy. So Trevor and Tony, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Hey, thanks, Dan. I'm not sure about incredible, but we'll take it today. Welcome, everybody. As Dan mentioned, my name is Trevor Talixon, the product manager for Same Time, and Tony Payne is with us. He's our senior architect for Same Time. If you're familiar with Same Time, worked with Same Time, and any time over the past 20 years, I'm sure you've met or talked to Tony at one point in time. But this is a webinar that is basically a follow-up to our Why Upgrade webinar we hosted back in January of this year. And one of the requests was, well, let's see it. Let's see the deployment. Let's see upgrading. Let's talk about migrating. And so that's what we're doing here. And that's why we've scheduled this session. So next slide here, Tony. Just a reminder before we get started, we have our idea portal for Same Time, and I'm going to post this pretty much in any session I do going forward as a reminder that we want your feedback, we want your ideas, we want your votes to kind of help us prioritize what features we really need to target for our upcoming releases that impact your environments. Next slide, Tony. And in this session, what we're going to be doing is Tony's going to be walking through kind of a live demo, talking and showing the deployment, going over some upgrade scenarios. And during that process, of course, he'll be talking about some troubleshooting aspects of it. And then we'll talk about migration and hopefully get a lot of good questions that we can address after, or we do welcome questions during the session. I do not mind, or we do not mind getting interrupted. So post your questions. I will interrupt Tony if he can address them in the moment. Otherwise, we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Next slide, Tony. So I guess that's it, Tony. I'm gonna swing this over your way to start talking about deploying on Docker.
Thanks, Trevor. As Trevor already introduced me, I'm Tony Payne. I've been with Same Time since before it was Same Time, all the way back to '96, last century. And I have been part of the L3 support team as well since it began quite a few years ago. And I've helped a number of customers and business partners and basically anyone get these systems up and running. I've done it since the since the days of 9.0 when WebSphere and a few other things were quite cumbersome to get up. And so part of the driving force behind this particular webinar was that I said that you could now get a system up and running in 30 minutes or so. And the challenge was made that, well, prove it. So that's what we're here today to do, is to show you that you can literally take a brand new Linux machine and get a deployment up and running on Docker within about 30 minutes. And that's what I'm going to do today for you live. So of course, just as an overview real quickly to spend a couple of minutes, if that, Same Time 12 is a very simple containerized installation. We support it on Docker or Podman. I'm going to be showing you Docker today. The steps for Podman, with the exception of one specific set of instructions that are Podman specific, are exactly the same, and you can be just as successful with Podman. We also support larger installations on Kubernetes, and of course now that's a slightly different set of instructions to do, but it is still relatively easy. If you have a Kubernetes environment, we have white papers and we even now support a way of doing it on Windows for Kubernetes, which might be the topic of a future webinar if there's interest. Just like traditionally, or for 11.5, we always we support LDAP as our directory, which means that you can still use Domino directory. We just don't do it through native like we used to do. We now require you to turn on Domino to LDAP. In fact, that will be the directory I'll be using today. We also use MongoDB for our data source. If you already have Mongo in your environment, or if you're using the Mongo Atlas, their cloud solution, either of those are fine, or you can install your own Mongo. I'll be installing Mongo and going through the configuration steps required for it today. So the big thing that changed with 12, of course, is that it's a fully containerized solution, which means that it's all run through these Docker or Kubernetes, small little services that build the big picture, but it's all controlled in those one interfaces. All right, so let me get on down to the next page. Now today, we're going to do a Mongo deployment. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we connect up to LDAP. We're going to deploy on Docker. We'll have some time when I get down to that particular part of it. We'll talk a little bit about stun and turn, especially if there's any questions on it. But we use stun and turn as a way to help. We use stun specifically to help our clients connect to the meeting services and get audio video flowing. We can use turn as a relay. Now both of those are topics that are very specific to meetings, audio video. They are a little out of scope for just this session, but I can talk a little bit about how you'll get them configured if there's interest in it. So you have to know those things ahead of time. Where is my Mongo server going to be? Where's my LDAP? What type of special config for it, if any, do I need? Because again, a good example of that is Domino is very different than Active Directory and some of the things I might choose to do. Whether or not I want to use TLS for it, those types of questions. Whether or not I'm going to deploy on Docker, Podman, or Kubernetes. Whether or not I need to make any modifications for stun and turn. My network requirements, in other words, specifically for the audio video flow, and then we'll install Sametime. That's all it generally takes. So let's get straight into a live demo. Minimize this. And the only things I have done ahead of time is on your right, let's start again. Let me just show you what I've got on the screen here. On the right is our 1202 documentation. And the reason I have that up is because I want it to be very clear for you all that as I go through this demo, I don't have any tricks up my sleeve. The only trick I have up my sleeve is I've done this about 1,000 times. Okay, so I don't really question the documentation. I don't really question, what's Docker doing, or how do I do this, or how do I do that, and that is one of the reasons that I know I can get it done very quickly, but it's also a reason that you can. The documentation that I'm going to walk through, as I do this, I'm going to copy and paste the command straight from it. You're going to see that the documentation is actually spot on for getting things installed. Now, of course, as I do it, I'll probably mention a few little things I've learned over the years, or over the countless deployments, things that our business partners and our friends have returned back to us as little tips and tricks that sometimes aren't obvious, the things you learn with experience. But other than experience, I'm not going to bring anything unique to the table. It's going to come straight from the documentation. On the left-hand side here, and I hope everybody can see the fonts well enough, is my CentOS 7.9 machine. I chose it because I can get it very easily. And again, like anything, you have to know the hardware, the software you're going to install into. And this is a particular environment that I'm very comfortable with. We have most of our customers are running on this particular platform. So I felt like it was a good place to start for a demo. There's no real differences between this and Red Hat or other similar Linux boxes. Sometimes there are minor differences in instructions you might get from Docker. You might run into a small issue with the deployment of Mongo or Docker that you might have to go to their documentation for, but I found that to be very rare. Most of the commands, so in CentOS, I'll be using yum. On Red Hat, I think you use apt-get, something like that, to deploy. Minor differences like that. The steps are the same. But on the left here, we have my machine. I'm currently logged in as just a normal user. The only thing I've done to prepare for this on this particular machine is to pre-upload my my Sametime Premium zip, which is what contains our code. But everything we're going to do first off is going to be just running the installs for Mongo and Docker. If you look at the roadmap, basically you make sure that the machine's going to do it right. You make sure that your user ID meets the requirements, and then you just go through the steps: install Mongo, set up and configure LDAP, set up the environment, and install the product. It really is that simple. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to installing Mongo, install the Mongo on Linux. On my left here, now for my ease, and because I know this particular account doesn't have the correct permissions to run Yum, I'm going to go ahead and switch to root. On your systems, that may not be a requirement. You'll have to, that's the kind of a thing you have to know, whether or not the account you're using has the appropriate permissions, whether or not you need to run as root to do certain things. Those are things that you have to know ahead of time. But so I know I have to run as root on this particular machine, and that's what I'm going to be here as. So the very first thing here is we will create our repo for Mongo. And like I said, I'm going to copy and paste straight from the documentation. For one, that saves me a whole lot of typos. When you get into VI, if you're not familiar with the VI, VI is just an editor. It's a text editor. It's very powerful. It's also very simple. The very first thing you do is once you run the command here and you're at a blank screen, you push the I key, and that's for insert. Copy whatever you're going to put in there. On Linux, you can right click and that's a paste. Once you've pasted in your contents, hit escape, and then you can do a colon right quit, which you can't see on the bottom of the screen here. Let's see if I can make that a little bit more obvious. And what that does is that is a write and then quit the editor. So now that file has been created. Now, the other instructions here are if you don't have the ability to use Yum, you can get the RPMs down locally. We don't need that because we're going to be able to do it the other way. We will then install Mongo. Now you can pass a little helpful hint. You can pass a -y to the Yum install command, and all that will do is automatically select yes for you at the end of it. But having been around this for a long time and who I am, I like to feel like I'm in control. So here in a moment, Yum will ask me if it's okay. And unless you know of a reason it's not, you'll always say yes, right? You just told it to do something. So you'll go ahead and agree with it once it gets down here. So we'll hit yes. And it will do its thing. It will take its time here for a moment. And then it describes here that you can verify these directories and things exist. This is where my experience says I know it does. So I will go ahead and start Mongo. And then there's other example commands here for stopping it and checking the status of it. So guess what? Mongo is now installed. Now we will do our setting up a replica set as well as a key file access control. Now, one note, I'm going to run through the steps here so that you can see how it works. But for the particular version of Mongo that I'm installing here, which is 4.4, this step is not specifically necessary. It's also not specifically necessary in this particular, whoops, what did I do? I didn't copy that right. It's also not specifically necessary in a single node MongoDB replica set, which is what I'm doing on this machine, which is the basic minimum to get up and running. But what these 3 steps are doing is creating a key file with a random secret in it that you would then share with other members with this member and with any other cluster members in your Mongo set. And all that is done is created a file in var lib mongo called key file, and that is now your secret that you would share. And this is more of a thing for 5.0 and later, where it's actually required. In 4.4, it's not required. But I wanted you to be aware of those steps, because right now, even though 4.4 is pretty much coming into its end of life, and you'll be wanting to move forward with Mongo and other releases. So now, I'm
Hey,
sorry.
Tony.
Yes.
Yeah, hey, I just want to, you commented real quickly on the versioning. Maybe expand on it a little bit. How we have 4.4, I think, is being demoed here, but we obviously support newer releases, and just our stance kind of quickly on the versioning of MongoDB and what we actually support and kind of going forward. And then also maybe just touch on real quickly, and you may go on or talk about this later, is how we can deploy MongoDB as part of the container as well.
Sure. So
these are questions,
well,
so that's why I interrupted.
You pretty much covered everything there. Right. The demo today is using Mongo 4.4 because that is the steps that I have in the documentation. That's not required to use 4.4. In fact, as I said, 4.4 is headed towards end of life, end of support from Mongo's side. So you'll want to move toward 5, 6, and or I think the most recent out there is 7. We have tested 6 without any issues. We're testing 7 as part of the FixPack 1 that's coming up. So you can use the version, you can use a much newer version. What changes there, of course, is that some of the steps that we have in our documentation might need to be modified, and that is specific to the install, right? Setting up the correct repo, because that repo that we copy there is specific to 4.4. So you would go over to the Mongo documentation for those steps, and that's a conundrum we have sometimes with documentation, is what do we push here or not. We support you regardless of the version of Mongo you're on, unless we find a problem that we can't literally solve in that moment. Most of the time it comes down to just getting Mongo configured correctly. One of the things we found recently was this security key file setting. And that because of that was a change between 4.4 and 5. But our work in Mongo is generally fairly, it's not Mongo version specific. So I hope that makes sense. So does that get the questions there?
It does, thank you.
Okay, very good. So our next step is to edit the MongoD.conf file, which is over in the Etsy folder. And what we're going to do there is to just set a couple of stanzas in it. One of the things that is a very common thing to do is this bind IP. So the way, I don't want to spend too much time here, but I've only got 30 minutes to get this done. But the bind IP here is telling Mongo, it's going to tell the MongoDB server, where will I accept connections from? In this particular case, the default is I will only accept a Mongo shell or a connection from this local host, which is never going to work in a real networking world. So it would work fine if you were only doing things on this machine and only from within this container. But what we want to do here, and for most practices, we will switch this to allow connections from anywhere, which is a 0.0.0. directive. Now you can also use, whenever you make a mistake in VI and you're not sure exactly what you changed, use the escape and just do a Q, :Q with a exclamation point or bang, so you can get out of it. This configuration file, like many, is very specific about its formatting. So I always want to make very sure that I'm there. So by putting bind IP 0000, it says basically I will allow connections to this Mongo server from anywhere. I can be IP address specific, or I can use the bind IP all setting as it says here, which is the same as setting it to 0000. And I do that as a starting point. Then I can always narrow it back down afterwards. This is especially true if your Mongo server is separate from your Sametime deployment. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the instructions here, it talks about going ahead and adding your security and key file. We do not need that, but this points back at the file we just created. If you had multiple cluster members, you would need this, but I would do this after we do our next step. And then over here, down at replication, this is what actually creates your replica set. So we remove the comment file, we space over to the P, and we add repl set name : space rs0. And the spacing and capitalization is critical in Mongo. Now that we've done that, we will save it, and then we can restart. So service MongoD stop, service MongoD start. And now we can get into Mongo. And let's see here. Done step 4, we're into Mongo. You'll notice there is no replica set, there is no nothing down here, just a normal prompt. In order to get replica set initialized, we enter the command rs.initiate. It will do its job. It's using the default configuration. It tells you the local host name, which is sometimes a very good thing to keep in mind. That is this machine that it knows itself as. And let me run Notepad up here. It's a good thing to remember. And you'll see it says RS0 other. Hitting enter changes to RS0 primary. That means now that your replica set is in fact operational and you're ready to go with your next steps. And you'll see that we are at the bottom of our page here. You can also do a couple of other quick commands. rs.status, that'll tell you the current status of it, what your members are, and if you needed, so one of the things that comes up sometimes is whether or not that host name is viable for other machines and other hosts to be able to connect to. In a replica set in Mongo, you might connect to it via an IP address. In this case, when I go to the config of Sametime, I'm going to tell it to use 10.134.106.16, the local IP address of this machine. When it connects to that machine, Mongo will say, hey, you need to go to the current primary, which may or may not be that same machine, and it will use whatever the host name is here to point it to. So a common problem will be if that host name is not resolvable. And you could do one of two things. You can either get that host name resolvable, or you can change it in this config if necessary. Now, I've done earlier testing, so I already know on this machine and in this environment, that host name is going to resolve for me just fine, so I don't need to change anything. But that's a good, important troubleshooting and information for you to have. So next step, we'll get over to configuring MongoDB for Sametime. And now we will create our users. Now we have a fancy little command here called admin equals db get siblings database of admin, or you can simply type use admin. In Mongo, anytime you type use of a database name, it automatically puts you in the context of that particular database. And now we will create our user. So db dot, and I pasted in. What did I miss? Oh. And that is the expected response. It will successfully create the user. Now you'll notice it's same time admin. In earlier documentation, we used to call this just same time user. And sometimes when you're going through the next steps here in a few minutes, that will come into play because you've been used to typing same time user and you'll get an authentication exception. So always remember that your username and password, the default is just same time admin and same time. They can be anything you want them to be that fits. Now we're also going to create another one called same time cluster admin. And now our users are created. We're going to now switch to the chat logging database. Another neat thing about Mongo is as soon as you switch to anybody that's ever done this for a long time used to work with SameTime, used to work with DB2. You used to have to run scripts and all kinds of things to create tables and relationships and things. In Mongo, all you have to do is type the word use chat logging, and guess what? I now have a chat logging database. If I want to then put stuff in it, which I do in this case, I can start inserting things, and there is no SQL scripts or other things you have to do. And all this is doing is literally creating a dummy record in the database because it's required. And the important part of this step that I want to make sure I point out is that it's hard to talk and type at the same time, is that it is case sensitive. A few times we have customers, we've had people come back with where they would do this in the sessions and events in lowercase, and then things wouldn't work. So remember that it is case sensitive. Of course, if you copy and paste the commands, you don't have to worry about it. And guess what? You're done. MongoDB is now up and running. We're in the chat logging database. We can show collections, and you will see that the two things we just created are now there. Same time, when it starts up at this point, we'll create everything else you need, the meetings database, the user info database, all those other things that do the things that Same Time does. MongoDB itself is done. So we can exit out of that command, and we're back at our next step. So
good.
Next.
Just a time check, Tony. We're at the 30-minute mark.
Okay, but I've only been doing this demo for 15. Let's keep that in mind.
And talking a lot, so that's good.
And doing a lot of talking, that's right. All right, so the next thing to do is install Docker. Now our instructions here, and if you want real instructions or more current instructions, you might go to the Docker, docker.org, the website out there, because that's where the most current Docker instructions will be. Our instructions will get you there though. The first thing to do is to make sure that the machine you're on has or doesn't have Docker. Older versions of, or prior versions of CentOS certainly shipped with an old version of Docker. That had to be removed ahead of time. If you just type the word Docker and if the system can't find the command, you're clean. You don't need to do any other steps. You can go on with the installation of Docker itself. So we'll copy, we'll paste, nothing to do there. Then we will add a repo, which is the next step here. You'll notice all I skipped here was the sudo command, but otherwise it's a straight copy and paste here. And then we will run the command here. What I'm hoping to do, and I know I spoke a lot about Mongo because there are considerations in Mongo, but what I am really wanting to do, and hopefully by the end of this session, is to dispel some of the mystery. I don't want anybody leaving here thinking this is complicated or that using Docker is somehow complicated. There's always considerations. Different companies will have different requirements, and you need to understand it, but it's not necessarily complicated. We're almost done installing Docker. We will be done here as soon as this screen completes. And then we'll run a couple of commands to validate it, and then that's it. And then we'll be able to do our work. Something I did note on a Red Hat 7.9 system was what you had to add an extra repo to get Docker to install. I'll try to get a tech note written up on that because that was new. One of the other things that's difficult for us in documentation or just in general is that Docker moves so fast, Kubernetes moves so fast, there's always updates, and sometimes they change little things on us, but it generally just works like this did. So it's complete. Docker is now installed. So we will start it. And then we can do a simple test of running a little hello world app from Docker. One of the nice things that it shows here when you do that command is it shows you that Docker itself works. It was able to reach out to the internet wherever this hello world library lives, pull it down, run it, and then it ends it. It doesn't keep running. So it's a one and done. That shows you that your Docker is up and running. You can run a command like Docker version, so you can see what versions are actually installed on your host. And then you can run Docker compose version to see that Docker compose is installed. Docker compose now comes with Docker. You don't have to do the separate step for installing Docker compose that we have here. And I need to get a note into this documentation so that you don't have to go through that step. But Docker compose is now there and ready for you. And guess what? Docker is installed. We are now ready to install Sametime. We're what, 16 minutes in? So here, installing Sametime on Docker Podman. All right, so now my next step. As I said, I had already pulled down the image and put it in the home domino directory. So now I will get focus on the right screen. That's over here. And I'm going to make myself a directory. We do not have any preference on where you put the Sametime install files. It is entirely up to you. When you run an install now with Docker or Kubernetes or anything else that we're doing, the local directory that you unzip the files to is what we call the home directory or the install directory. We're not moving files all over the system. There's not stuff over in var, over in lib, over in other places. For Sametime, it is all lives in that one location. My preference is I create a folder called opt Sametime. Really easy to know where you're at. So I'm going to go to that directory. It's currently empty. I'm going to unzip home domino Sametime premium.zip to this location. Now all of the files that I need for the Sametime install are being unzipped here. The Sametime premium.tar, which is, you can see it's kind of delayed here so I can talk about it for a second, is the big tarball that contains all of our images that will then be run on Docker or Kubernetes. Same images for all these places. So that's the one that takes a little while. That's the meat of the installation, as it will. You don't have to worry about it. You don't need to do anything with it. Just be aware that that's what it is. Once you have moved those images out into the Docker repository, and I'm saying you have to move them, but you don't. It's part of our scripts. Once those images are in the repository, you never need to worry about them again. If you needed space, you could delete the tarball. but we don't generally need to do that either. So there's a lot of files there. The most important one in this environment is install.sh, and that's what we're about to run here in just a second. To give you an idea of other things in here that are important for a Docker world is that we have what's called a, where'd it go? A Docker compose YAML. This is the file that tells Docker what to run, what its environment variables are, and if necessary, additional things like file system information, extra host information if you need to override or add to the DNS, things of that nature. You'll notice right now there is two template files, a .env template and a custom.env template. These are the files that hold our environment variables. Custom.env is a very short file, contains all the ones that are absolutely required to be set. And .env, which will .template, will become just a .env file, and that contains a much larger set of environment variables that you'll rarely need to get into, but you should be familiar with it. Those are the three key files in a Docker or Podman environment for that matter. So if you're opening up a support case and we say send your config files, that's the three files we absolutely need to see, because it will tell us all about your environment. It'll tell us what you have set, what you're trying to do, and things of that nature. So if you're doing an upgrade run, you usually don't have to do too much these days, but I always recommend making backups of those three files so that you've got them. And keep in mind that Docker Compose YAML is version specific. So you can't you'll always get a new one of those with each new install. So if you're upgrading from 1201 FP1 to 1202, Docker Compose YAML is going to change. Why does that matter? Because if you've made specific changes within that file for the older version, you will need to make those changes into the new version as well. All right, so that's just a real quick information on that. Let's run install. The first thing that the install script does is load the images. And by loading the images, this is moving the images from the tarball into the local Docker repository. This step will seem like it's taking forever, especially if your machine is a little slower, but that is a 3 gig tarball. It takes a moment for the host to unzip it in memory and then start the moving it up. So for the moment, is there any questions?
No new questions, Tony, which means you're doing a great job.
Thanks, Trevor. A couple other key files in here while we wait. Image catalog.txt, that's a key file that we use that tells us the build date of your system. So if we ever want to confirm which version you're running, that file will tell us the exact build date of it. Other files in here deal with setting up, if you're in a environment where you need to do multi-tenancy, then you would use this script would help with that. There are migration tools in here, which we can talk more about in a minute, or we can spend a moment here now if you're trying to move things from an older Domino deployment up to Sametime. When we talk about migration and doing that, one of the things that has to happen is that your current buddy lists, which are stored in Domino in an NSF, have to be converted over to LDAP format, and then they have to be moved over from Domino into your MongoDB, and that's what those zips help with. The Helm folder is for Kubernetes deployments. The find deployment, the prepared deployment are files that we use for deploying out in Kubernetes. And now we see that we've unzipped our tarball, and now we are loading the images up into Docker, the Docker repository. This does take a moment, but you can see now that we're moving right along. This is generally where I would play the Jeopardy theme. We have worked over the years to continue to simplify the deployments. And again, I think I teased it a little earlier on, but we also now support doing a Kubernetes install using Docker Desktop on Windows for the Windows shops that aren't willing or are unable to move to Linux and still want to use Sametime 12. If there's interest in a demo of that, please let us know, and I will be happy to walk through that in a future webinar. Thing about it is that takes about the same amount of time these days. We have done everything we can to script these deployments and minimize the requirements such that you can get up and running very quickly and have a functional system. Probably another neat thing with the Docker the Docker desktop type deployment of Kubernetes is with Kubernetes, we also now support the idea of managed charts. One of the complications, not really complications, that's not the right word. One of the complexities, not that much better of a word, with Kubernetes is sometimes how do you script a deployment and get everything you need in one shot. Well, with managed charts, we can do a much better job of that. You have to know, we can actually deploy Mongo for you with it. We can go ahead and deploy stun and turn for you if you need those. You can script it, and then you can then just take a simple YAML file, which is just a descriptive file, over to any place, any Kubernetes system with our managed charts and have it up and running very quickly. It's just another way of packaging this up such that we keep making it simpler. I mean, I realize nobody really likes watching a DOS prompt, a command prompt run, but believe it, this is very simple compared to the days when we had to install WebSphere, Domino, DB2, and a few other things that we would go from, you'd plan out a week or better, depending upon the size of your environment, sometimes months to get a full environment up and running if you're doing HADR for a super large environment. And now you can do that in Kubernetes inside of a day. And half of that day is the planning steps and the validation. The install itself is simple.
One takeaway here is Tony is installing our premium, which is chat and meetings, which is a much larger deployment. You can see here it's extracting a lot and loading a lot of meetings related stuff. So just to comment, Tony, if we were going to install our chat only deployment, which wouldn't have meetings, this would be much faster, right?
It would be a little faster.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't include the obvious, you can see here the meetings webhook, the meetings recordings node, and the meeting location. You wouldn't have those items, so it would be faster. But even here, we're already done. I think I've been yammering for about a minute. And now we are actually at the point of the install. The script will be prompting you for information. Now I'm going to use just a dummy host name here, because the unfortunate part of this particular demo system is it doesn't have any internet access, so we won't be able to live test it with a browser. But your Sametime server name is the host name that you expect your end users to use to hook to it up over the web. So I'm going to use sametime.company.com. The server domain name is where we would be scoping our authentication tokens and other cookies. So it would usually follow the pattern of company.com, and you just hit enter here. The Mongo host. This is wherever you have Mongo installed or wherever you're going to be using Mongo. Like I said earlier, I'm going to be using the local IP address of the machine because I know that's where it is. The port 27017, the default. Anytime you see, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but anytime you see something like this, this is the default answer if you just hit enter. And then if it has a space there, that is expecting you to put something, or it will be an empty if you don't. Admin. Be afraid of typos. and then it's going to show you the URL. Now, there are some cases, and again, if you're in if you know your Mongo environment requires a different URL, you can override it. Otherwise, this is what we have generated for you to use, and we don't want to override it. What type of LDAP server are you using? We support Active Directory, we support Domino, we support Open LDAP. Basically, any of the more common, more recent LDAPs we will work with. With Active Directory, you just need to know a couple of things ahead of time, base TNs and things of that nature. But that's not normally a problem. Now, I didn't deploy an LDAP server here because I already knew the one I wanted to use. If I would quit typoing, and whether or not you want to use TLS. One of the nice things, I don't want to use TLS in my particular case, but one of the nice things we did in version 12.02 here was that we now ship a default TLS trust store. So if you are using one of the common certificate authorities or common signers for your TLS certificates, you probably won't need to create the trust store. And those of you that have done this in the past know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, you just create a trust store with the correct signers in it. I didn't talk about it, but I hit enter for a JWT secret because this is a new system. I'm not going to deploy a turn server, and I do want to configure LTPA. So now, the reason I'm doing this is because one, if you already have an LTPA key file because you brought it down from your connections environment or from some other environment, or you've already had a shared LTPA key for years, you would simply have it on the machine and tell this script where it exists, and then it will do everything else. It will prompt you for the password to validate it, and it will move it to the correct location. Otherwise, as in this case, I'm going to generate new keys, and we use WebSphere to generate these keys. So the script will pull down from Docker and run a Docker image of WebSphere for 5 minutes here at the most, whatever it takes to finish this here, just to pull the LTPA keys from it. And then you could use those LTPA keys like you would anything else. You'd better take them over to Domino. You could take them into connections if you needed to. But it's just a way of us generating an LTPA key file. And it will run it down. It will run it, pull the LTPA keys from it, and get rid of it. So it's not being used for anything other than just getting this key file. This takes just a moment. And if you're not using LTPA and Sametime is on its own and you're not going to be worried about single sign-on with other environments, Verse or connections, then you don't need to do this step. And you will see here that it validated the LTPA configuration. So Sametime, and this was a step that actually stumbled people and myself earlier on, LTPA is now done. Sametime is now perfectly configured for LTPA. An admin's email address. One of the things we did in version 12 was to add in policy administration, which means that we now have a GUI interface for both monitoring and policy administration, so you no longer have to mess with XML files. And now you'll see all this fancy stuff here, but after I hit enter on that admin address, which is what that was used for, Sametime is installed. Docker is now starting it up. The script is finishing its work, and Sametime is installed. We're just waiting now for the containers to start or restart as necessary, because we had to do a couple of little steps here. But we now have a Sametime environment. If we do a Docker PS, Docker PS, it's just going to tell you what is currently running in the Docker environment. Sametime is up and running. If we do a Docker compose logs community, this will give me an output of Docker of the community logs. And right now it's still starting up, so it's not done yet. But we could follow these. We can now see that Sametime is up and running. Another change that happened, if we look in our directory, is now we see our .env file and our custom env file, and those contain what we told the script to put in them. The keys that were generated, the admin information, the domino, the same time, the LDAP information, the Mongo information, all in those files. We have an LTPA config folder. That is where your LTPA keys live. We have a Sametime config folder. This is where all of our config files. So one of the things that happens with Docker and any containerized things, it takes those environment variables and then creates config files that the containers then use, and those all live under the Sametime config folder. The nice thing under here is that we have this web folder. This is where your keys would go, your branding information would go, but here's this neat little downloads folder. Any file you put in that downloads folder will be accessible from the web of your system. sametime.company.com/downloads/file.txt. Like if you're using managed community settings, or if you want to get the clients put in a place where everybody can, the installable clients, you can put them here. In the keys folder is where your TLS certificates are for this particular environment. And those are three really key folders to keep in mind here. Also in Sametime config is the policy folder. And here's the neat thing about this folder. It contains your policies.user.xml and your policies.server.xml file. So this is where we used to have to make manual changes, if you remember. Now you don't have to do that. But the key thing about this folder here is if you had a 12.01 or a 12.0 policy file that you wanted to keep because you've made custom changes to it, you could drop that in here, and then on the next restart, the system will move that to a v12.02 version and keep your settings and any custom policies that you've created. So we really tried to make this simple for upgrades, as well as making it easier for you to manage policies through the UI. And now we'll go back up. So anytime you're working in this system at this point, getting logs, checking the system status, you'll do everything from within the context of the folder where you unzipped it. Everything is right here. So if I want to see the status of my proxy server, which is, you have to remember to type the right command. I want to see the logs of the proxy. I want to see if we're connected to the community. This here tells me now that this the Sametime proxy server for my web chat application is now connected to proxy or connected to the community, and we should be good to go to log in. Docker compose logs community. We should get toward the bottom of this, seeing prints like current usage user zeros, login zeros, tells me that this system is up and operational.
One quick point I wanted to bring up here. We got about 5 minutes, but if you're familiar with our old deployment, we had a proxy server, a community server, and a meeting server all separate. When we brought it in to be containerized, those separate servers are now under the same container, but they're separate different services. So he's calling the community server's logs, he's calling the proxy server logs. They're still separated inside the container, but that's the big difference. If you want to look at proxy server logs in an 11.5, you would go look at that server. They are still services inside the container, but separated.
That's exactly right. And the last tip I want to give you, because I know we're out of time, is that if you type the command that I put here, Docker compose logs JVB, that is our video bridge, that is our meeting server's audio video component. Grep with a -I for indiscriminate, the word discovered, will tell you the public address of the machine that will be used by your clients for audio video purposes. So when you connect into a meeting and the second person joins and you suddenly have to start sending audio video streams, they will be headed to this public IP address over the UDP port of 10,000.
Great.
But here's the thing. I realize that I'm running a couple minutes late because I talked a whole lot, made a couple of typos, and I think I've shown a whole lot, but we are well under an hour, pretty close to the 30 minutes that I promised for getting a same time server on Docker up and running, installed, complete from nothing. And we're up and running, and we're ready now for connections and clients. Assuming I had the firewall open, which unfortunately is the one part I couldn't do in advance.
Yeah.
So there we go.
This is great, Tony. To answer a couple questions that have come up in the chat. One is this being recorded? Yes, it is. And Dan and his team will be posting it to YouTube and sending out to their registers where it can be viewed. So we'll have a recording of this. The other one I want to try and address here real quickly is the question was, will there be updated documentation for CentOS 9, MongoDB 7, since, you know, as an example, CentOS 7 is kind of reaching end of support. From our system requirements page, we got ourselves in a little bit of a trouble in the past of just trying to encompass every release under the sun moving forward. And what you're seeing in the past couple of releases from our system requirements is this is what we tested at the time of release. And I want to make it clear that we will support future versions, because as Tony mentioned at the beginning, it's difficult to keep up with these dependencies that are releasing so quickly and so often. So we kind of have a best effort statement that we say, but that really is that we will support a newer version until we have identified that it's the platform that's the problem. But we will support newer versions. When we release new versions, we'll update those versions to tell you that we have updated our testing. This is exactly what we tested on. And anything moving forward from that, again, we will stand behind from a best effort standpoint and support it as completely as we can.
Right, and to reiterate what I had mentioned earlier, like Mongo 7, you want to install Mongo 7 and use it, go for it. You may need to use the Mongo documentation, their official documentation for specific steps. When you get down to the same time part of running install.sh, if you're on one of the systems that we've already run it on, then it will just work. I don't care if it's Red Hat using Podman, if it is, I think I want to say Rocky Linux. I know we've had a few business partners work with it. Ubuntu, you're still just going to run install.sh. Where your complexity comes in is whether or not you need to go to docker.org and get their install instructions for the specific OS you're using, or mongo.org for their specific steps for the OS you're using. But after that, it's still this simple.
Yeah, the MongoDB instructions we have in our documentation is 4.4, and it was meant to be, it's presented as an example, right?
That's right.
So we will work
That's
on
right.
updating that going forward, or find a better way to present that. If you could bring the presentation up here real quickly, Tony, just want to show a couple of slides, because we didn't get into talking about upgrading, but I do want to quote one of our business partners, Roberto, because he told me this at Engage last week, that he's never seen an application upgrade so easily. So I got his approval to use that quote. It really is, because of the containerized deployment, a simple path to upgrade. And we can talk about it in a future webinar, but it really is quite simple.
Right. If I wanted, and I can say it in 3 sentences. If I wanted to upgrade this system to FP1, the one I just did, I would take the new FP1 zip file that I downloaded from FlexNet, unzip it to opt same time. My env and custom env will be preserved. Docker compose.yaml will be overwritten. You want to overwrite all files in the folder. And then the tarball will of course be overwritten. I will then run install.sh. Install.sh will move the new images to Docker, and will then prompt me, hey, this looks like an upgrade or install. If I choose upgrade, it will preserve my settings into the new files and add any new settings that are needed, and you're done. Of course, if you have made changes to Docker Compose YAML, please make sure you had a backup of that or know what you made changes for so that you can add them back in. The most common example are extra hosts. But that's it. Upgrades are simple. The upgrades in Kubernetes aren't any more complicated. Prepared deployment looks for deployed same time deployments, and then asks the same question. What do you want to do? You want a new install or do you want to upgrade your existing? And we'll then do the work to help preserve things and get the new code up in place. It is really that simple. It's I don't know how to say it any simpler than that. It just unzip, run the program, and you're done.
I'd like to show or highlight a couple articles or white papers out there. This is our Software U. It's really a 101. Wicker is our TA. He produced more of a workshop under Software U. In the next slide, Tony. That was based off of 12.0 FixPack 1. A lot of the concepts, well, I would say 99% of the concepts all still apply to our 12.0.2. And then next slide, Tony. Last week, Tony and Casey Tooley created a white paper on deploying Sametime 12.0.2 on Kubernetes. A very good white paper, and I highly encourage anyone interested in the Kubernetes environments in Sametime, take a look at this. And do I have any other slides here, Tony? I want to do. Our software lab services also can help with any Sametime deployment. If you're interested in HCL hosting or lab services supporting your environment, please contact them. This slide is from Engaged, so Chris Miller is not obviously still there, but Gary's email is in the lower right. And do I have another slide here, Tony? Oh, questions. One of the remaining questions here from Tom was about LDAP credentials and where do I go to enter those LDAP credentials. And during the install, it did post that or ask you for it. But if you needed to go back and change, Tony, what would be the file or how would you change those credentials?
You would change them in the custom.env file. It's toward the bottom.
Thank you.
You would literally go into custom.env here, and you'll find the whole LDAP section. And this is where you could change your whether or not you want to all of a sudden be SSL enabled, if you want to change and or set your bind entry information, change the base DNs, things of that nature.
Okay.
You would just set them here and then restart.
Yeah. We covered a lot. You did a very good job, but as you can see, if you take out the talking points, as Tony was talking, 30 minutes is pretty reasonable. The only thing that was deployed before this that is a requirement was our Domino server, our Domino LDAP server. That was there and ready for us to use, but we installed Mongo, we configured Mongo, we installed Docker, and we installed Sametime, all within a reasonable, I mean, I'll say 40 minutes, but that's pretty straightforward in this Dockered environment. And then just a follow-up question, when you make changes to the custom.env file, those changes would apply, yes, after a restart?
Yes, you would do it after you do that change, you would do a Docker compose down and a Docker compose up -D. And okay. Up -D, so Docker compose down stops everything. Actually, you don't even have to do it down. You can just do an up -D and the changes will be there, but I'm old school, so I always stop. I always do a full stop and a full restart habit. And a habit that's worked for me very well, because then I know everything is done.
All right. Well, we ran a little bit over, but that's because we gave you more information, and that's good. And thank you, Tony. This was very good. I don't have any more questions here, but Tony and I are pretty much always available through the support channels. Like I said, the AHA portal at the beginning, you can share your ideas, vote for your ideas, but we welcome collaboration. So if you need assistance or have questions on anything, feel free to open up the support case, post it on our Sametime forum, or our emails were at the top of the presentation as well. And with that, Tony, unless you have anything else to add, I think we will wrap this up.
I'll just say happy same timing, and let us know if you need any help, and we're here to do it. Let's get it done.
Excellent. All right, thank you so much. Dan, are you still there?
I am still here and want to thank everybody who participated, and we look forward to following up with you with some information on a handout for the presentation and a link to the YouTube replay. So with that, we'll call it a session done. So great job, Tony. Great job, Trevor. And thank you for joining.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.